Hello, Haiku here for a spoiler review for the upcoming March of Machines. So, quick thoughts after having reviewed the spoilers. I think there's a lot of strong cards, so I think this is going to be a pretty impactful set on both Explorer and Historic Pauper. But it's funny the way that it's going to be a little bit impactful. There's a lot of cards that are equivalent to existing cards, but getting copies 5 through 8 is going to make the decks that would want to play those cards viable or potentially just even more consistent. So that's just something interesting about the cards. But there's going to be a lot of powerful cards and cards that are a little bit difficult for me to evaluate. So I'm going to do my best today. Obviously, I'm still practicing my card evaluation. But this is kind of where I put it after thinking about it myself and then thinking about or reading the discussion that other ideas that people have had in our Discord. So starting with white. Convoke is always an interesting mechanic. It's a little bit stronger in white because white has vigilance creatures. Aerial boost, I think, is actually going to be a thing to think about. Anytime you can make a card free, it can kind of make something happen unconstructed. And so I think this card is actually pretty viable, even though it's just a typical combat trick. Combat still matters in Historic and Explorer Pauper, and so in a lot of spells are based on burn or damage that turn, and so a combat trick is still viable, like answer to removal and its answer to some creature combat. So I think Aerial Boost is a consideration in decks that play a lot of creatures, especially creatures that are going to be vigilance, are going to have vigilance. Here's probably the best land cycler. So land cycling came back. This is a pretty unique effect that we don't really get at common anymore. Basically the Fiend Hunter effect. This white has a lot of reanimation. It also has blink, so they can see home in both of those. Obviously, when you blink, the first creature you exile comes back. But if you exile the token or something, it's not going to ever come back. So you can exile some tokens and then blink this. So I think this hurts a lot of token strategies. The big card that it affects is the Trumpeting Herd. It makes a 3/3 and then it rebounds, makes another 3/3. That was always a very strong player because there wasn't a lot of good ways to punish the fact that there are 3/3 tokens. But this certainly does that. The fact that when you exile it, even if you kill this creature, you're never getting back your token. And then place cycling is really relevant now because we have typed duals, which means that any dual land that says plains plus swamp or plains plus whatever other land type, you can fetch it with the plane cycling in addition to just regular plains. But then also you can fetch the Eldraine lands, the lands that come into play if you have 3 of the existing relevant land type, then it has an effect. So the plains one gives a +1/+1 counter. So another kind of relevant synergy. So I think this is going to be a player. There's plenty of ways to get around the 6 mana cost, either playing it with green or, like I said, reanimating it, and then the whole pattern of being able to plane cycle, put a land into your hand and then reanimate it the next turn. So it's a reanimation card that gets itself into the graveyard for value. We've had plenty of these effects. Having more is fine. I think we've kind of maxed out on the 2/2s for 2 that have lifelink in white. Black doesn't really have any, but those are the two colors that have those kind of spells. And so another one potentially makes those decks that are looking for lifelink cards even easier to find.
more copies. Here's Feat of Resistance, just a little bit better. It's always a pretty relevant spell. I always kind of worry about protection spells that cost 2 mana. I generally think that it's going to be pretty taxing to hold up 2 mana for for protecting your own creature. And so compared to like Snakeskin Veil, which is like main deckable all-star, it's a lot of work to do, but this card does a lot as well. So it's gonna be close for that card. This card, I think it's gonna be just relevant for draft. I don't think it really can make waves in constructed Pauper, because I don't think there's going to be a deck that's going to be really reliant on flipping Incubator tokens. They don't cost that much to flip. You save 2 mana by hitting with this, so I don't think this is going to be a relevant constructed card. Backup is another really awesome mechanic, and the set design, I think they knocked it out of the park with a lot of these cards. They made it pretty relevant. So this, coming into play and then basically allowing another creature to tap, and then the whole thing that backup plays really well with proliferate. So I think this particular card is probably not going to be constructed Pauper playable, but the other ones that I'll talk about in the future, I think take them over the top. But I think this one costs a little bit too much. I mean, the effect is very strong, but I just don't think for this cost you can play for mana value creature that doesn't add to the board more than itself and doesn't draw cards. So getting to cut short. So cut short, having Convoke means that you can certainly make it free. And again, I think white is going to be the color where Convoke is that much better. Obviously the Planeswalker part is not relevant, but the tapped creature is relevant for constructed Pauper. And there's plenty of ways, even if you're an aggro deck, there's an Eldraine flyer that has one of its adventures to be tap 2 creatures, so you can even turn this on in an aggro deck. So again, aggro decks that have incidentally are planning to play vigilance creatures, I think this Convoke spell is definitely player, and I think it's going to be slightly better. I mean, it's a little bit of a downside that it's this one, I think this one's the better one, but the fact that it only hits tap creatures, it kind of generally in most decks that are going to want to Convoke are already going to be wanting to attack. So it might come that the other Convoke spell, Aerial Boost, might be a little bit better, but I think this one will be the more played one. All right, moving on to Enduring Bond Warden. And I just want to point out that I've talked about basically every single comment so far that a couple of ones I've dismissed, but I'm not even positive that they are dismissible, but really no like completely vanilla comments. So this is an upgrade to, I forgot the name of it, Star Pupil. Star Pupil. So it's just an upgrade for the Proliferate decks. So they'll certainly be playing that since they're already playing Star Pupil. And this part about the backup one, giving this ability to the creature, most of the Proliferate cards are already going to have that ability, or you're going to want to put the counters on Enduring Bond Warden anyways because it's early in the game. So this one, the special things you could do with backup I don't think really come into play that much, but it's going to be an overall strong card. Again, throwing counters on creatures with a 1-drop. So relevant. This one, not constructed playable, just too expensive. Golden Scalar or not. Infected Defector, also not constructed playable, a little bit too expensive, although all of these are interesting because they're not just like completely vanilla creatures. Inspired Charge we already have on Arena. Double Striker, one at 3 mana, is also not constructor playable in my mind. So I don't think that's. Yeah. Knight of New Coalition, 4 mana value to bring 2/2/2s into play. That blinkable for value. We already have a card very similar to this from Dominaria, and then we also have a couple of sorceries that also do the same effect, basically. Not unfortunately. I mean, it's a very good card, but we already have the effect, and unfortunately, it's not been found a home. But the Vigilance, which the other ones had as well, may make a deck with using the convoke cards that we talked about before. That Knight of New Coalition plus those other ones, the token makers, can potentially make a white token deck that spits out a lot of tokens. And then the fact that these tokens are 2/2s kind of protects you a little bit from Wraths, and End of the Facilities and Suffocating Fumes. And so there's a lot of cards that beat up on 1 toughness. And so if you were going to make a token deck, I could see a token deck full of 2/2s potentially being viable. It might be a little bit too slow at 4 mana is when all of those cards come into play. A potential player, but I think it's going to be unfortunately on the borderline of not playable. Core Halberd, I don't think it's relevant. The Vigilance, again, it's a nice little bonus to Short Sword, but I think equipment decks have enough choices now that they're not playing this. Realmbreaker's Grasp, just a typical now pacifism that's slightly better than pacifism. I don't think these are constructed playable. There's too many decks, I should say, that can use a pacified creature for value or blink it to return it without the enchantment that you use to neutralize it. So I think inherently these cards are a little bit, unfortunately, just too risky to play as your removal spell of choice because it's not going to actually remove the creature successfully. Scroll Shift, a strong effect. We already have Blur in blue, and I think Blur and being in blue is kind of the color that you want to blink in. So obviously these kind of go infinite with the Ardent Elementalist, and there's another blue card for 5 mana that brings back an instant or sorcery. So you can blink it and bring back something. The fact that this can blink other things other than creatures, where Blur only can blink creatures, is slightly interesting. So there may be something here that in decks that have a lot of other permanents that you're trying to blink. One benefit here is, like, if you're playing a Skyfisher deck with permanents that gain value, instead of having to blink your Skyfisher, you can blink the enchantment that you were going to return and replay with the Skyfisher. You're going to blink the Ichor Wellspring as the artifact, and that way you save a little bit of mana. So I think this card is borderline playable. I don't know if there's quite a deck that wants it, because basically the core Skyfisher decks have so much value. I don't know if they want to go this deep. I mean, certainly it's much more value and it fits into the deck theme, but it might be just so greedy as far as, like, they need to be affecting the board. But maybe this brings back the decks that more play the Red Omen for creature control. That one only deals 2 damage, but it was certainly played earlier in other historic Pauper metas. And so Scroll Shift may kind of bring that style back, where you're playing Omen of the Forge is what it's called, and blinking that to try to not fall too far behind as a removal spell. So definite consideration. I just don't see a deck right now, but I'm certainly willing to bet that something can come out of this card. Sigiled Sentinel, another backup card. This one, again, is not quite playable. I guess I thought when I was looking through it, I was seeing more backup cards that I thought were really interesting, but so far the backup cards that I've gone over in white, I guess, are not quite to the level. They're very strong, Again, vigilance is coming in, with the convoke stuff, is going to be relevant, but I think this is a little too expensive for proliferate. I really like Sunder the Gateway as a card. This basically disenchant plus pay 2 mana down the line and get some value, and then basically this is a 2 mana bear, because you can choose this effect always, or sometimes it's a 4 mana bear that a 4 mana 2/2 that destroyed or disenchanted something of the opponent's. So I think this card is actually main deckable in white decks that are going to use like a bear, and the fact that it's an artifact already means, and white is a color that's played in Affinity. So I think this card is a definite playable. And like I said, I think it slots better into Affinity decks, but overall, the fact that both of these modes are pretty relevant. 2/2 for 4 that disenchants, and a 2/2 for 2 is a reasonable worst case scenario. So Sunder the Gateway, I think probably one of the best cards that I've gone over so far yet in white. Maybe it's close with Scroll Shift. And I guess the 1/2 with the backup 0/1 that puts a 1/1 counter. All right, finishing up white, a 3/1. Unfortunately, there's a lot of knights that got added, and there was a knight theme in Dominaria. But I just don't think 3/1s are where you want to be in constructed Pauper. There's just so many things that hate on 1 toughness. It makes it tough to play. Unfortunately, this is a strong card, but not quite up to constructed playable yet. All right, moving on to blue. Similarly, Essence. So for when we're talking about constructed Pauper, the battle spell part's not relevant. So this is an Essence Scatter that the opponent can pay 4 for. So I don't think this is playable. I know you do get an Incubate too if the opponent pays, but if the opponent pays for your counter spell, you're very upset. So not a good card. Disturbing Conversion. Also, I don't think this card is quite playable. The flash is a little bit interesting, but it's not quite there. The fact that the creature is going to stay in play means that it's going to be relevant on blocks. So basically, any deck that pairs with any other color is going to have better removal. If you're playing a mono blue deck, you're probably playing a mono blue tempo deck where the blocker is relevant. So I don't think you want to play this card. As far as Dispersal, actually, I think it's low key. When I first looked at this card, I was like, I don't know if it's there. But I think it's cheap enough at 1 mana plus the Surveil 2 when you're dealing with attacking creatures that I think this might be playable. I'm just thinking of there's a lot of blue decks that want more cards in graveyard, especially instants or sorcery. So this adds +1 itself, and it could, when it surveils, dump some more instances or sorceries into the graveyard to make your terrors cheaper, to make your frantic inventories turn on without having to cast the first spell. So I think this might be relevant in blue decks that are going to be attacking back and forth, so getting attacked and attacking. And you also can cast it to save your own creature and return it to your hand, and then still get the surveil bonus. So I think this is a role player. I don't think any deck's going to want 4 of these, but I think some number of decks are going to play a couple of these. Expedition Lookout. There was another card recently with one that has this similar kind of effect where in early game it doesn't do any, or it's a blocker early game, and then at the end game it's an unblockable attacker. It was oil counters. It was a 2/3 that needed some oil counters. So I would put this in the same vein. I think both of those cards are interesting. The only issue is milling the opponent is inherently risky. there's a lot of, so I'm thinking of Explorer Pauper. There's a lot of decks that use the graveyard because the graveyard hate isn't really there for Explorer Pauper. And then for Historic Pauper, there's a ton of graveyard bonuses, but then it's held down by relics. But if you're relying on a card, you're not going to want to relic the opponent if you're trying to get value out of them having cards in their graveyard. So unfortunately, I don't think this card is playable, because you just don't want the opponent with 8 cards or more in their graveyard, because they're likely being able to use those cards against you. This is basically 5 mana for a 3/3 draw card. I don't think it's quite there. I mean, you can spread it out over multiple turns, but it being a sorcery hurts it a little bit. But it also helps some, Terror and Serpentine Curves deck that want more instant sorceries. Incubate 3 is a pretty large creature, so it might be able to do something. And then again, Incubate you, because it is an artifact. It is a little bit of like consideration in affinity decks. So I could see this, even though overall, like the amount of mana you're putting into it, generally you don't want that effect. I think it has some things going for it that it could potentially see play as a 1 or 2 of in those Serpentine Curve / Terror decks, as another body that also increases your sorcery count, or your sorcery and instant count in your graveyard. So consideration. Again, though, I don't think you can play too many of these because it costs a little too much at sorcery speed. And when you're thinking like, okay, if I pay 1 more mana, I could get a Serpentine Curve, and instead of drawing a card, I can just finish the game. I think this one is just on the borderline where 1 or 2 in a deck could probably see play. I'll definitely try it out to see if it plays better than it looks. So this one is for me, it's very close, and I think it's tough to exactly say how close it is, or if it's over the edge of playability. So I definitely would be trying it out and seeing how it works. And I think in both Explorer and Historic Pauper, this card can see play in those Terror decks. Moving on to Furtive Analyst. This card, unfortunately not playable in Constructed. This card, mill would always be interesting, especially in blue decks. But recurring to the top of your library is just a big downside. It costs a lot of mana. I don't see this one there. You would probably play the 2/2 for 5 that returns a sorcery to your hand rather than this one. So I think this one, unfortunately, costs a little too much for putting on top. Or again, yeah, I think that's yeah. If it put it into your hand, it would be more reasonable. If it costs less but put it on top, then it would be more reasonable. Medium Minds, another inspiration that is slightly better than inspiration. Blue doesn't have a lot of random creatures that are going to be sitting in play, except for the decks that are going to be playing like Gitaxis and the crab. What is it? The Clue Crab? I forgot its name. And then there's also the Falaji Archaeologist that are just kind of sitting 0/3s that are sitting around doing nothing. And so like these 2 cards might see play in those Terror decks in the same decks, where you're just trying to put a random creature into play to stall the opponent's attacks until you get a Terror or a large Serpentine Curve in play. So consideration, certainly. Again, I don't think you're going to be maxing out on the 4 of these, but the fact that you have some blue decks that are making tokens that they're kind of just sitting around untapped can potentially make this a playable card.
Certainly, again, all for both of these cards, I think they're borderline enough. And again, it's so difficult to say exactly that I think both of these are going to get some spotlights in some decks I'll play to try to see if Meeting the Minds or if Eyes of Gitaxis are what you want to be doing in those kind of decks. And like I said, I think it's close enough that I'm going to start by playing with them and then seeing if there's other better things to be doing. Moment of Truth, this was an earlier spoiler, one of the earliest ones. I think it's a solid card. The thing is, though, Explorer and Historic are getting so mana intensive and efficient and fast with all the cards. So every set obviously is really bringing up the power level of the formats. I think this might be a little bit too slow. It does a lot. Being able to dump a card into the graveyard is pretty relevant, and getting a card you don't want onto the bottom of your library is pretty relevant. So this is a really good anticipate that some decks may want. I'm thinking like some of the combo decks that are really trying to assemble certain cards in their hand may want this type of anticipate. It digs you pretty deep and does almost enough for paying 2 mana. The only issue I see is like, so decks that play Omen of the Sea are abusing the fact that there you have a permanent of Omen of the Sea in play and then being able to bounce it and stuff, where this effect would be more in the decks like Serpentine Curve and Terror decks that are wanting more instants and sorceries in the yard rather than permanents in play. But this is, it's just on the edge of too much mana for, just basically card selection and drawing one card. Oculus Whelp. I don't think this is a relevant card for Constructed. Another card, this one borderline playable. We have a couple of these where you get the 2/2 flying and a 1/1. And it's close, but I think the Cloud Conceer, where it's you get a 2/1 flyer that draws a card, is probably stronger than that you want to play that rather than get a token in play, draw a card. So I don't think this one is quite relevant. And the other thing to think about, any of these cards that bring in a token with the creature, I always try to pay attention to if one of them is a human. He's then turns on of one mind by itself, and this one, neither of the creatures it creates are humans, so it does not turn on of one mind by itself. And I think if we get a card like that, that would be a certain thing to really consider. Just to be able to turn on of one mind with one card is, of one mind is already seen play, and so a card that just turns it on by itself would be relevant. All right, moving on to Protocol Knight. I don't think this is playable. It just costs a little bit too much. It does a lot, but it's not quite playable. Okay, this is the one I'm excited about. Saiba Cryptomancer. This is going to be the bane of all decks that can't deal with hexproof creatures in the future, because this is the cheapest hexproof creature that we have so far. And the really unfortunate part is I figure most hexproof creatures are just going to be playing this and not paying attention to the backup at all. They're just going to be playing this, getting a 1/2 with hexproof, and so they get to flash it in at the end of turn. So it plays well against decks that are trying to counter the hexproof creature. It taxes their mana because they could play this at their end step and then play the 3 mana hexproof creature on their main if you spend your counter on it. So it really hurts the counter deck's plan against hexproof. And then any of the other decks that are trying to use Suffocating Fumes or End the Festivities mean it coming in as a 1/2 means that you can't have that plan for this. So this card is going to be extremely strong, and this is by far the strongest card of this set, because it will be a 4 of automatic in all of the hexproof decks in Explorer and Historic Pauper. It hurts me to see, because I don't really like the plan of the Auras decks.
it's not very interactive, and so the gameplay that it creates is not very interesting. And it kind of pushes the meta a little bit because you can't really play a control deck because, again, it plays well against counters unless you're playing black. And unfortunately, the R deck the playing black, the R deck for the edict effects is why I say you have to play black and control. Unfortunately, there's plenty of ways that you can get random creature tokens in play that negate your edict effects in Explorer and Historic Pauper. So this just I think this is like I said, by far the strongest card of the set, and it's going to push the hexproof decks into tier. I mean, they were always very strong, but I think they're now solidly going to be a tier 1 deck. It just depends on who wants to play the deck. I think some people don't like I said, I don't like playing against it, and I wouldn't really be interested in playing a hexproof type deck and more kind of trying to figure out answers that I could play against the hexproof deck. And unfortunately, I'm seeing this card, I'm like, I can't see an effective answer. The fact that, again, it has flash and hexproof, and it has 2 toughness when it comes into play, and you back up on itself. It would be a cool card if there were decks playing this cool backup, and you could save a creature and give it a counter and stuff like that. But unfortunately, this card is gonna be used in the more aura based degenerate decks, or not, in my mind, degenerate might be a little unfair. So yes, this is my prediction of the card that we'll see the most 4 of play. And I think this might get Ethereal Armor banned in Explorer Pauper. I think this with Ethereal Armor is just going to be hell to answer for most decks. And so I think it literally might put things over the top. Super. I mean, it's a strong card, so I always want to see strong cards get added, but unfortunately, the deck archetype that it's going to enable is a little bit unfun to play against for me. So mixed feelings about this one, but again, this is my pick for the strongest card. This card's not playable. Temporal Cleansing is interesting. Again, in the decks, I'm going to go back to all of the cards that are going to be kind of potentially playable. Some Moment of Truth, Meeting of Minds, and Isaac Gitaxis in the Spells Matter, or I guess it Spells Matter in your graveyard decks, which is your Terror and your Serpentine Curve decks. This card could be interesting if you're playing more with the Philology Archivist and for the Crab Investigate card. So this might be relevant 1 or 2 of in your deck, but you're definitely not playing all 4 copies of this card in those kind of decks. And this card, unfortunately, too expensive even with the Convoke. You don't want to be tapping that many creatures. I was super excited for, obviously, cycling to come into play. I mentioned when I talked about the plane cycling card that the fact that they can search up the dual typed lands as well as search up the Eldraine spell lands, or the cards that do the lands that do something when you have 3 other islands in play. And the strongest of them has been Mystic Sanctuary. It's banned in Paper Pauper. But unfortunately, this card is not quite there. It might get by on the strength of if you ignore the creature part of this card and you just say, search up either a dual land in your deck or search up Mystic Sanctuary, shuffle your library, and then have a 6/6 or 5/6 in play or in your graveyard. But again, those decks don't want creatures in your graveyard. So if this was an instant or sorcery, it would have been absolutely busted, no matter how miserable the instant or sorcery was. But this creature just doesn't do enough. So I think the format's fast enough that you don't want to be paying 2 mana to search out your Mystic Sanctuary. It's borderline because again, it is a form of a tutor, but I don't think it's going to be quite playable. And then this card is a trick, and the fact that it cycles is interesting. I think it's potentially playable. I can't think of any deck that would want this kind of effect, but it is a strong effect. So no home right now. Strong effect. So basically, I'll stay a little bit agnostic on this card about saying if it's going to be constructed playable, but I'm heading for no. But for that card, it'd be interesting if I'm proven wrong. This I treat as kind of a equipment version of the black 2-mana, give the creature indestructible or give the creature undying. So and then the fact that this one is an equipment, kind of it sticks around and gives your creatures +1 in the future. And then it's also a permanent for black decks that want to sack, that are playing Disdainful, or what is it called? Oh gosh, I forgot the sacrifice artifact card. So for all those reasons, I think this card is a player, and it might be a little bit too weak. When I think about it, I think the power level is a little bit low for historic, but it might be Explorer Pauper playable. Yeah. So something that a deck that can take advantage, basically, when we talk about like cards like using all the parts of the buffalo, like the fact that if the deck can take advantage of it being an artifact in play, take advantage of giving random creatures +1/+0. So you want like a creature-based deck that has multiple creatures that are attacking the opponent in the general plan, as well as the fact that you have an extra permanent in play. So if you have a deck that has all of those things, I could see this being played. And there's certainly black decks that do that. So this can certainly see play. I think Indestructible, just as an aside, Indestructible is actually a pretty good plan against the hexproof decks. Giving Death Touch creature indestructible, I think, is a pretty good plan. So now that I'm again, my prediction that hexproof is now going to be kind of a tier 1 deck, if Ethereal Armor is still going to be allowed to be played, this kind of gets value to as a surprise blocker. Put it on your Death Touch creature in black. Save your creature to block another time, or the reason why I think it's good against hexproof is because hexproof, Ethereal Armor, and a lot of the other auras give first strike, and so when you think about blocking those creatures, you need to survive the first strike damage to deal your Death Touch damage. So that's where I see all the indestructible cards, or the cards that give indestructible at instant speed relevancy. So you have green cards that do that and black cards. And so this is certainly a thing. There is a card though that is for 2 mana instant, gives indestructible and Death Touch. And so I think that may be the answer you want for hexproof at this time. Unless you're playing Edict. And it's kind of redundant, right? We're talking about answers for hexproof in black, but like I said, the edicts aren't a reliable answer to hexproof, and that's a difficult part for control decks to think about. And so you may be playing that 2 mana give indestructible and Death Touch rather than this card if you don't have Death Touch creatures of your own already. So I guess overall, I think this is an interesting card, but I think its value is going to get more play because I think that hexproof is going to be a big player in the meta. This card, it's an interesting card because giving a creature +1/+1 and then being able to swing that turn with lifelink can really swing a race. And then itself being lifelink means that it's going to be a threat for the opponent cracking back on the block. So I think this is actually a pretty interesting sideboard card for decks where it's an aggro mirror and they just need a little bit of life swing to turn the game in that deck's favor. And so I think this card is really interesting. The only issue is that we already have a really good card in Unexpected Things, which is the 2 mana instant speed, give a +1/+1 and lifelink. And so I think that card is probably stronger than this card, being the fact that it's a little bit cheaper, I think, is the big thing. So this might not see play because that card is just a little bit better than this card in those situations. So here's the first of the cards that are reprints of previous cards, but now they have different names, so you can play copies 5 through 8. So this is Village Rites. I think this one does not make a deck. So I don't think there is a deck waiting in the wings that would just be turned on by having 8 Village Rites. But the Menace, the card that cares about Menace and does a threaten effect where it steals the opponent's creature, can attack with it and then sacrifice it for value. So those red-black decks. Those are the decks that come to mind that would want to play 8 Village Rites to consistently get off that combo. But I'm a little bit down on that combo in the first place. But this certainly kind of gets the mind gearing as far as what decks kind of were not quite possible because it wasn't quite consistent if you only had 4 copies of Village Rite in your deck. This one I don't think is the one that's going to see play, because I'm just, other than that, the Tentative Connection deck, I don't think there's another home for 1 mana sack, because the one that gives the treasure, I got to figure out the name. Deadly Dispute, that's what it's called. Deadly Dispute is just so good, even though it's 2 mana. The fact that you get a treasure back to sack means that it's pseudo only 1 mana, and so Deadly Dispute being in the formats of Explorer and Historic Pauper mean that this duplicate of Village Rites is not quite there. I think you play the 4 Deadly Dispute before either Village Rites or Corrupted Conviction, except in the Tentative Connection deck. Here's an instant speed. We already had this effect at sorcery speed, but instant speed, create a treasure token. There are a couple cards when treasures first came out that care about treasures, spending treasure mana on them, and they get a better effect. Now that treasures has become an evergreen token, every set makes those cards potentially more playable. I don't think they're quite there yet. But there's something to keep an eye on is those cards that get bonuses for spending treasure mana on. This card, not really playable. The 1/3 enchantment, I forget what it's called, that drains the opponent but doesn't have to tap itself in sacks creatures or enchantments is much better than this card. The only thing that's a little bit relevant is sacking an artifact. And it is a little bit relevant because in decks that want to potentially do like a steal and sack, where they use a threaten effect and sack the creature, like Corrupted Conviction would want to do that. The fact that this is free is a consideration, but I don't think the effect of sacking that thing is relevant, and it's just so costly to have to tap a creature. So you have to have this in play for a full turn, and then you can go your combo, but then you're wasting a card from your hand sitting in play, using your little synergy, I guess is what I felt. So I don't think this is playable, basically. Another card that drains, but I don't think is playable. This is another card that drains, but this one costs a little bit too much, and the fact that the battle part is not relevant for constructed Pauper just means that this card's not playable. Surveil, again, getting more interesting, but the fact that this is not an instant or sorcery itself means that this isn't playable. This is a better, oh gosh, I forgot what the card is called. So this is an upgrade, a strict upgrade to that card, because you can sacrifice either an artifact or a creature. The other one was just a creature, and it was -5/-5, and now it's -6/-6, so that's great. This is certainly a player. The only thing, though, is Annihilating Glare. Annihilating Glare at sorcery speed just kills the creature outright and has the same effect. And then you can also pay 5 mana for it instead of sacrificing. So it's slightly different. Obviously, the blowout of sacking a creature that or an artifact that was already going to die to an opponent's spell and then using it to turn on this to kill a creature a bigger creature is relevant. So again, I think this is in decks that have random creatures in play, which there are plenty in black. This may be a consideration, although I think there are probably already now better cards than Final Flourish that are in black that those decks could play as well. So it's just crowded out. It's a strong card, but it's crowded by other cards that do similar things. Let's see. Sorry, I didn't remember this one. So put a target creature or battle from on top of your graveyard. So not quite where you want to be. Milling is always going to be interesting, but putting the creature on top rather than in your hand means that the courier bats that only get turned on when gaining life, but getting 1 life a turn is easy to do with your lands in Pauper. That card would be better than this card. Most better. The fact that this is when it dies rather than when it comes into play means that you probably want to play the other one. Swamp Cycling, like I said, relevant. Backup, giving menace to a creature. So this is the one where backup to a creature I think is pretty relevant because the ability of menace kind of you get that bonus of the hasty 2 +1/+1 counters, right? So this card is a consideration. I think it costs a little bit too much for constructed Pauper, unfortunately. But it is in colors that want to reanimate things, so that's a possibility. The fact that it goes to the graveyard on its own for value, and now with the dual type lands, it can fix your lands. It also can get Mortuary Mire, or the one that's from Eldraine. I forgot what the difference is between those cards. So this is a consideration. I think it just costs a little bit too much. So there's probably better things to reanimate. But it may be kind of like a little like bridge where it's not quite the best card, but it's the more flexible card in that style deck. Here's another thing that I think is really strong in this set. I think they really spent a lot of time trying to make 1 mana value creatures relevant, because the whole issue with them is they become very outclassed later in the game. In the old way of designing the 1 mana creatures, you just generally wanted to stay away from them. But as we saw in white, that one was definitely relevant for the periphery decks. I think this one is pretty relevant, getting value. And then again, black being a deck that does tend to mill itself. So you don't necessarily are playing the front half, although the front half is reasonable. I mean, again, 1 toughness is really, really hated on in Pauper, but this value giving a 2/2 for 3 mana is relevant. So could be a player, especially in decks that are dumping him into the graveyard without having to cast the first half, which, again, there are plenty. Okay. Ichor Shade at the beginning of your insip. So I don't think it's playable. Strong effect. I mean, they're slowly dropping the effect of these cards that grow if certain conditions happen at every turn. But we just got the Delirium one in green, and I think that one is slightly in better colors for it, and it obviously turns on with just Delirium instead of having to something basically go to the graveyard for value. And it only triggers 1 time per turn. So like the sacrifice and grow ones are better because it's every time something gets sacrificed. Mirrodin Avenged. So this one is a reprint, or not a reprint. It's like another copy of copies 5 through 8 of You Are Already Dead. So this one I think makes a deck. So You Are Already Dead was already a strong card. And you really wanted to pair it with End of the Festivities. But unfortunately, only having 4 of the End of the Festivities and 4 of You Are Already Dead in the deck means that you couldn't really play that combo consistently. But now with 8 copies, you really can. You just play a bunch of other creatures that also make this these types of cards so you have creatures that are 1/1s that attack in, and then the opponent has to decide if they want to block it, and then turn on your removal plus draw card. Or you just keep it pinging away with your little creatures until you draw your end of festivities and just unload all of these cards that were stuck in your hand. So I'll certainly be playing the deck when this set gets released. I already have the deck prepped in the deck builder, and I've already posted my initial draft of what the deck would look like for Explorer Pauper. But I think it's actually probably playable in Explorer and Historic Pauper. I think being able to main deck and the festivities is relevant enough. Like I said, there's a lot of 1 toughness creatures, and there's a lot of hate going around, even main deck for 1 toughness creatures. But I think there's room in the format for even more hate on 1 toughness creatures with main decking 4 end of the festivities and 8 of this effect. I think is going to be a possible deck, a Rakdos deck. Yes. So if the hexproof 1/2 with flash wasn't printed, I think this would have been the most interesting card printed in this set. That actually like makes a deck. So yeah. So I guess shout out to this one, even though it is a functional reprint of a different card. The fact that you get 8 copies puts it so it's kind of a weird situation. So I guess if I had to rank things so far, I would, and it's tough for me to keep everything in mind, but I think so the hexproof 1/2 with backup gets number 1 position by far, and then this is I think a strong number 2. Maybe I'm mistakenly forgetting another one that can be in contention for this. This effect we have a ton of. Rogue as a creature type may be relevant in the future, but I don't think right now there's anything that benefits from rogues. Oh wait, no. I think it's one of the party members. So this being contribute to your party count and having enter battlefield effect is actually kind of relevant. So maybe a party deck comes out of this. Black has some party matters cards, so it's possible actually. I would have to go through and see the other cards that the 1/1s for 2 that the opponent discards a card, and to see if any of the other ones had any party typings. But this one being a rogue actually might matter now that I think about it. Maybe I'll make a party deck with this card. I don't think this would be relevant in Historic Pauper ever. It's just the power level is just high enough that this wouldn't be good enough. But in Explorer Pauper, I could see this a party mechanic working well with creatures like this. I'll have to see the numbers of the other parties members. Wizard, Warrior, I forgot the other one, Rogue and something else. But yeah, so actually, yeah. So my first initial take was this wasn't relevant, but the creature typing on this one actually might make it relevant. This is another effect that gets a bonus for opponent having 8 or more cards in their graveyard. Again, I think just milling the opponent is actively bad in both Explorer and Historic Pauper, that this card is not playable. This card, when it first got released, Incubate was first. I think there's other better Incubate cards, so I don't think you want to be doing this to Incubate. And then let's see. This one, again, a little bit too cute. The fact that it's instant speed, it means that you can kind of respond to hate that's going to exile an important creature out of your graveyard and then bring it and another relevant creature back. And the fact that it fills your graveyard means that the opponent can't, because you don't target the creatures as you cast the spell, so the opponent can't exile the exact creatures that you're removing. So you always get a chance to bring something back because you're milling before the opponent. The opponent cannot act in between these two lines. The whole spell will resolve, so you always have a chance to bring something back. So a possible player, but I think this effect for 3 mana is a little bit too expensive. And so there's better synergies you can do to using creatures in your graveyard than just bringing them back to hand. And then this removal spell's not relevant for constructed, costs a little too much. This card, again, all these abilities that have the creature itself have to tap, kind of go down. in my mind. So I don't think this is quite playable. Again, it's hurt by the fact that it's 1 toughness. And then the fact that it's a value kind of plan, but it's also a one mana 1/1. So it doesn't quite gel together, and I don't see it going into a deck. This got some discussion because, again, it gives Menace, and so Menace is relevant for tentative connections, and then again, creating treasure tokens is a little bit relevant. But I think Sticky Fingers is overall the buff that you want to giving your creatures, or where that one happens to be an enchantment that draws a card if it gets removed. Where this is an equipment that stays in play, I still think you want the Sticky Fingers more. And obviously, Sticky Fingers, it's only 1 mana to play it on the creature and attack with the creature. Where this one, you have to play this for 1 mana and equip up the creature and then attack. And so those kind of aggro decks where the menace is going to matter, this is just too expensive for those decks. Again, so Sticky Fingers, I think, just goes over the top of this card. They're not quite the same, but that's kind of how I'm evaluating that card. And Sticky Fingers, I think, is a reasonable card. It gets a little bit of play in Standard Pauper, but I think it's strong enough to see play even in Explorer Pauper. This, unfortunately, the gain haste is interesting, but the fact that you're having to tap to things in when you're trying to give toughness to stuff to attack with, it just doesn't work. Only thing that might matter is in the Zealot deck. So in the Zealot deck, giving haste is pretty relevant for that card. And so you do have sometimes some random creatures in play. And so being able to play the Zealot for 4 mana and then having this at instant without having to pay the mana, and so being able to attack that turn with the Zealot might make it playable. I think this is, again, a little bit too cute to play. I think the enchantment that gives creatures haste, providing you a little bit extra delirium, is more relevant for Zealot decks. But again, anytime you have something free, able to be cast for free, it's a consideration. But I don't think it quite gets there for Zealot. If it untapped 2 target creatures, that would be super, super interesting because, because then you could attack with the creatures that you gave the buff and the haste to. So you play the Zealot, but it doesn't have that. I'm just wishful thinking. Not playable. Again, Mountain Cycling is pretty relevant, but I think this card doesn't have a home. It costs too much, so this kind of value with Mountain Cycling doesn't quite go good with a 5/5 or a 5/5 for 6 mana. So basically, any kind of the cycling cards, you want both halves to work to be relevant, and I don't think this finds a home, a 6 mana in a red deck, even with cycling. The only one that can find a home, ignoring the other half of the card, was the Island Cycling one because Mystic Sanctuary is so strong. But even that card I don't think is strong enough on the Island Cycling part. This card, I think, is the backup card that you actually care about. That backup gives this ability to the creature that you're giving the +1/+1 counter to. So the fact that you can give a +1/+1 counter, but basically have a hasty loot. So if you have a creature in play, you get to loot. The only issue is you've already invested 3 mana. And so when you're looting, I would want to kind of create decks, when I'm thinking about looting decks, that can use Madness. And then Madness, you are going to have to invest even more mana. So instead of being a 3-drop, this is like a 4-drop. So there's another haste, a creature with Riot that loots itself. And so that one is probably the better card than Hanger Scrounger. And even that card doesn't quite see play. They're both really close, but I don't think they're quite there. And I think it's just because they're likely to die before they can get another attack. And then that first attack that you've already invested 3 mana means that you probably can't utilize your Madness cards that turn as well. Not relevant. And I mean, there's plenty now of +1/+1 counters that are moving around. So maybe I spoke too soon by saying this is not relevant. It's a pretty big creature, I guess. Yeah. So I would have to see. So this actually, yeah. So this kind of means that you're probably looking at what backup cards are close to relevant. So we already know the white one is. So maybe if you're playing a white-red deck, but I think you always want, with backup, you're probably wanting to go white-green to utilize proliferate synergies. But the fact that this can get there with just one additional counter actually might make it see play. So this really depends on the other cards that are, again, you don't want to play a bad card, or you don't want to play a card where you have to play a bunch of bad cards in your deck that you weren't going to play anyways to try to turn this card on. And so I could see a lot of decks trying to do that to make this work. And this is not good enough if you're sacrificing the rest of your deck quality. This card is very, very interesting. Marauding Dreadship. It gives you it's a pretty cheap price. Gives you 2 permanents on the board, and the fact that the other permanent gives you can accrue if you have another 2 mana that turn, can accrue the vehicle. Makes this interesting and relevant card. So I certainly think this will see play. The fact that both of the permanents it creates are artifacts means that it's probably going to go into the affinity deck. So a very strong card. I guess I would say that this is probably number 3, if I'm remembering correctly, after the You Are Already Dead reprint and the Hexproof reprint. So this is a strong card that can fit into some number of decks. And by itself, it's like the whole package where the Crew 2 going with the Incubate 2 means that it plays well with itself. So you don't have to add a bunch of other cards like this card, where it needs a lot of other cards to make it playable. This one is already the whole package. So, this is a good case study in what makes a card good and what makes a card a trap. I think, well, maybe I'll be proven wrong in the next 3 months, and this is seeing all the play and this is not seeing any play. This effect was already in standard, although I think the equip cost was 4 instead of 3. So this is a slight improvement to that card. I still don't think it's where you want to be. I think you just want to pay the 1 mana plus the other 1 mana for Bone Splitter rather than the flashing in a +2 power. If it provided any bonus to toughness, the flash would be relevant. But the fact that it doesn't provide, you can't really surprise something that crazy and trade up. Right. I guess the +2 power means it can trade up, but it can't. The creature won't survive when the opponent didn't expect it to survive. This card's not playable, a little bit too expensive. There's a lot of these token effects for red and 1. There's one that's slightly better, which gives you a haste. One of the tokens has haste. So you can attack that turn. But there might be a critical mass of these token decks now in specifically red that you can make a specific token strategy in red, which may be a deck, but again, being 1/1s, they're just so weak to End the Festivities and Suffocating Fumes, which are played very, very regularly in sideboards and sometimes in main deck. So I think overall, a token strategy using 1/1s is much more fragile than the aforementioned token strategy using 2/2s in white. So a very strong card because, again, it's giving a lot of extra copies of a similar effect. So I think there's potentially 4 different create 2 1/1s in red. And it might be just 3. Maybe I'm overcounting it by 1. But that's a lot of similar copies of the same card, so you can get a very consistent deck. But again, fragile deck strategy. But the consistency of being able to do that might put it over the top. Let's see. This one not really relevant for constructed. This one, actually, I was a Searing Barb. I thought was a little bit interesting. When you think about it, it's like 5 mana for a 1/1 artifact that can deal 2 damage. But you can spread out that cost, so you can pay 3 to deal 2 damage. So I think it might fit into the decks that are going to use the You Are Already Dead and the Mirrodin Avenged card as initiation. So you give 2 damage. If against a bigger creature, you have the Mirrodin Avenged to finish off the creature and draw a card, or 2 damage just kills the creature, and then later on you have a 1/1 that you get to play, get to transform. And the 1/1 kind of has a little bit of haste because when you pay the 2 mana, it's already been in play. So the fact that it transforms rather than you create a new creature means that it gets slightly better. So this is an interesting card. I don't think it's quite playable, but it has enough stuff going on that it might be. This card, again, Convoke, I always have a lot of respect that it can make things free, but unfortunately this just takes too much mana. So even if you're tapping 6 creatures to play nothing, you're tapping 6 creatures and you're not using the 6 creatures that you worked so hard to get into play for anything relevant. So this is just a flexible removal spell. So not playable in Constructed. Let's see, this is not relevant for us because we don't have battles in Constructed, but a 2/2 for 2 with Trample with upside in red is actually pretty unusual. But there's not stuff that really takes advantage of trampling. I think if we get some more cards, this keyword might be more relevant, but I don't think there's a bonus for being able to trample. This card, interesting, is a human, so that creature type actually helps out a little bit. And then I always like the cards that give haste and also have haste. So a 1/3 can stick around and attack for a couple turns, and then the turn that it's relevant to give another more important creature haste, then you can do that. So this might be playable in the Zealot decks. And just I don't think that they're trying to kind of do this kind of plan. And the enchantment in the Zealot decks is so much more important for Delirium than having a 1/1 or a 1/3 beater in play beforehand. But like I said, not having to pay the mana that turn that the Zealot comes into play is pretty relevant for that deck. So that could be a consideration. That's the only deck that I really think that you get a huge payoff for giving haste. Is why I'm highlighting that card for both of the cards that give haste. That's the huge payoff for giving haste, and there's no other card that really benefits from attacking the turn it comes into play as much as that card does. Like it literally ends the game for the opponent almost. So this is a reprint. Obviously, the old one didn't have this whole thing about Planeswalker or Battle, but it still has the same effect in Constructed. Pauper. That card was relevant in decks that could generate a lot of red mana and wanted to cycle through their deck for the combo, which is basically Mogwarts. But even Mogwarts didn't overload on that card. They only played a couple of them for random removal, and the fact that it could cycle lands later on in the game till you found your combo for Mogwarts. So its equivalent sees play already, but those decks never wanted more than 4 copies anyway. So having additional copies doesn't make a difference, and then the little bonus of Planeswalker Battle doesn't change it enough. And then we're coming up to the end of red. War Train Slasher. Again, not relevant, the battle part. And unfortunately, just 4 mana for a creature that doesn't do anything when it comes into play is not relevant for a Constructed Pauper. Okay, and then this is the other repeat. And actually, this probably goes over. Let's see, what was the card that I gave the top 3? Okay, so this one is probably number 4 because this one takes number 3 spot, or maybe even number 2 spot. So this is a reprint or another copies 5 through 8 of Reckless Impulse. Reckless Impulse is a strong card that's played 4 ofs, and I'm sure those decks would benefit from playing even more copies of Reckless Impulse. Maybe you're going all in to play all 8, but you're definitely wanting to play more than 4 in those decks. So maybe the numbers 5, 6, 7, or maybe even 8, but certainly more than 4 can fit into that deck. So this is also a constructed all-star, but happens to be just a mirror copy of another card, just with another name, so you can play more copies in the deck. So I'd say this and Mirrodin's Resolve are tied for number 2, and then this is number 4. Where's the vehicle? And then again, Hexproof by far number 1. This is interesting. This deck, this effect at 1 mana is always interesting as a surprise. Untap and block with reach. We do have a card from I forgot what set, Ikoria, that gave the reach counter, and it was +1/+3 for the same cost and same untap. So I think that card was probably better. It is probably better. It's seen in some sideboards. I like playing that card. I think it's a nice comeback trick that's relevant against Air Assault from like mono white. Speaking of Air Assaults from mono white, this is a very, very flexible card. I think it's flexible enough that you could actually consider main decking this card. So basically a disenchant plus plummet, all in one card. We also have a couple other cards that have been printed in the past. So they cost 3 mana and they were instant. Then there was the one that is it's a sorcery and it proliferates if the thing costed less than 3 mana. And then there's another effect where, what is it called? It's the one that conjures cards into your hand in Historic Pauper, and it can conjure a disenchant, or it can cycle, or it can plummet a creature. So it ends up costing 3. So this costing 2 and still being as flexible as those other cards is interesting, but sorcery speed kind of takes away from it. And the fact that those other ones that had 3 mana that were at sorcery gave you a slight bonus, or the other one could cycle itself, made, I think, those cards slightly better than Atraxas Fall. So I think the one that conjures the plummet to your hand, or the disenchant to your hand, or cycles itself is probably the better card to main deck than Atraxas Fall. But it's super interesting that they keep adding these very flexible answers that you could, getting close to justifying playing main. This card, I don't think you really want this effect. But again, all of these cards I think are borderline playable, but I don't think quite playable. Chomping Kalvu, here's another one where the backup part is kind of relevant to give a creature +1/+1 and then basically get it in or likely get it in unblocked. Could be relevant, but I think 4 mana for that effect is a little bit too expensive. And then, of course, when you're behind, when you don't have another creature to utilize its ability, it's a pretty miserable 4/4 for 4. That's not going to be that relevant in the meta. Backup counters are relevant and proliferates in green, so that gives it a little bit of possibility to see play. But I think this is not quite there for those decks. I think those decks want to be a little bit lower to the ground. Have a little bit more effect on the game state than this has. This is an interesting blink target. It's unfortunate that it's not in white or blue, or not unfortunate. It's just worse because it's not in white or blue. Where those colors can blink and reuse their creatures more frequently. So I don't think this is going to be quite playable, but I could see it being playable if we get enough blink spells or other spells to abuse the fact that the ETB is really good. Not relevant for constructed Pauper. Cycling is always an interesting mechanic, but I don't think this is a good enough card. Decks that are going to be wanting to throw it in auras already have hexproof creatures to throw it on, so Ward 2 is not going to matter. So this just unfortunately is too flexible and not good enough in any of the modes it does. This effect is interesting because in Historic Pauper we have the indestructible artifact lands. Putting counters on the artifact lands and then animating them later on in the game can be interesting, but I think this effect is a little bit too expensive. Instant speed's also interesting, but I don't think this is quite playable. Also not quite constructed playable. This one, there's just better effects. A 3 mana for a 2/2 that enters the battlefield and gives you some value. This one is another one of the, I think it's almost like a cycle of 1 mana 1/1s that give value once they're in the graveyard. This one's relevant for proliferate decks, but I don't think it's quite up to the par. It's definitely a strong card, but I don't think it's constructed playable. Like what I would compare this to is there's the Vigilance, the card that gives +1/+1 in Vigilance and has flashback for 1, and Travel Prep. So both of those are cheaper out of the graveyard, and then the front end I think is more relevant than getting a 1/1 without any counters. So that's why I don't like this one as much. Just so it's a good card, but there's cards that are better. This card, unfortunately, 1/1 for 2 mana that ramps you is unfortunately too expensive, a ramp card. And then the second ability doesn't have an effect in constructed Pauper. This one, I think this one is a trap card. The fact that it's restricting you to only the milled 2 cards that you can choose from means that it's just too restrictive. Returning a permanent from your graveyard is a very strong effect, and I could see why they didn't want to print that at common. But this is just way too restrictive. So it's just too likely for you to miss, even if you stuff your deck with only 4 Seeds of Hopes and everything else is a permanent card. You're just still. It's not if you miss. It's also like, what if you hit 2 lands and you're just paying 1 mana to put a land into your hand? It's just not a good card. This is another one where the backup ability, if you have another creature in play that turn, can be relevant to give a creature +1/+1 and Death Touch. I think this costs a little too much, and there's not really a home. So the backup wants to be in proliferate decks, but this costs too much. And then if you back up onto another creature, then this creature is not going to have the counter. So overall, I don't think you want to be using this card. So this doesn't quite have a home, and so I don't think it's constructed playable. Shout out again to another of the land cycling cards. Green has a lot of ramp, so and this is a pretty reasonable. Anytime you got a big body with trample, could be reasonable, and the fact that it has reach means that you don't die to flyers the turn you finally get into play. And then again, when you're thinking reanimation, being able to dump itself into the yard and then reanimate it. Although I think white and the black ones have the advantage there because they're in the colors that the reanimation is going to happen in. So overall, I think these cards are strong, but not quite have a home, and I don't think they're going to have a home. So here's another way to animate lands. Unfortunately, this one is just till end of turn, so it's not quite playable. I think the blue one that draws you a card and instead is a 4/3 is more relevant. Although it doesn't animate a land, it just makes the creature a 4/3. So I guess it's a slightly different card, but Vengeance Earth is not playable. Let's see, and then this one, obviously no battles means that it's not playable. Thespian, not quite playable. Again, the one toughness really just unfortunately is hated out in the format too much. And then this basically a Gravedigger effect, a little too expensive, not playable. And the fact that you can't loop Gravediggers, I guess they really don't like you looping them anymore, but the fact that you can't with this one also is points against it. And I think that finishes out. I'll just kind of go over. I think there was a couple artifacts that might be. So this one's interesting, but I don't think it's quite playable. The Vigilance is really what takes it over the top. And I think it's the whole design of the card, right? I mean, you use a creature you play that turn.
to crew this and attack with this, and then you can use that 1 mana later. But unfortunately, you already spent 1 mana to get a different creature in play, so you might not be able to use that 1 extra mana that after it attacks in. But it is attacking for 3 and still keeping up with mana, so it may see play. I just don't quite see it. Here's a free Convoke spell, but it's an artifact, so it's really relevant for Affinity. So this is going to be a big playable. So actually, this might go as number 5 now that I think of it. And this is close enough that it's in the discussion for top 10 of the set. I don't know where exactly it would land. I'll have to kind of again go back and think through all of them. But this card is definitely going to see play in Affinity. So I think this one is probably number 5. It's probably worse than the red vehicle. Actually, this one might be better than this is worse than the red vehicle in Affinity decks that play red. In Affinity decks that aren't wanting to play red, then this is obviously better. Hot takes here, but this is going to be a very strong card for Affinity. Let's see, and then these effects are never playable. I think we already had that card, and then this is just for limited. This one was interesting, but I think the 2 mana, the filter effect that draws a card when it comes into play is more relevant than late game being able to destroy a creature. Although most of the time, these ones really don't destroy the creature. They give the creature like -5/-5. So, destroying the creature outright and also being flexible enough to hit enchantments too kind of makes this more interesting. I really am hoping eventually Trinket Mage comes to Arena, because obviously, 1 mana, bring up this card that can potentially kill something relevant is a cool effect in the toolbox deck. But I don't think this quite has a home on Arena Pauper. And then we already have these cards on Pauper. So that concludes my review. Leave your thoughts and comments. Any cards that I missed that you think are going to be Pauper constructed playable on Arena. I think it's pretty easy call to say that. Where is it? It was toward the end of the deck here. This is going to be by far the most impactful card on the Explorer Pauper and Historic Pauper meta, probably causing the ban of Ethereal Armor. I think this just puts that deck over the top. And then my number 2 and 3 are just basically reprints of similar cards that allow you now to play 5 to 8 copies of those cards. And then Affinity gets a little bit of choice on Arena. So, like I said, leave any comments, disagreements, other cards that I missed. Love to have more discussion.